Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level learners of English. Recently, I have been thinking a lot about challenges that language learners face when communicating. Learning, vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation are obviously difficult tasks, but I think something else can be just as challenging. Context and culture. Words and grammar are not the only way we communicate. The world isn't always direct and clear. In fact, some cultures and parts of the world rely extensively on context to communicate meanings. So today, we are going to discuss culture and context in language learning. We'll discuss low context cultures, high context cultures, and how this affects English learning and English usage. I think this is a really important episode, so I hope you all listen to it. You can find a full and free transcript for this episode on Spotify or on YouTube. If you don't listen on YouTube, check it out on YouTube. The best free transcript there is, I think. And if you're interested in taking your English learning to the next level, become a Patreon subscriber. Lots of extra content, bonus episodes, and conversation practice every single week. Please consider joining. I need a few more members, and I'm considering putting the price higher in the next few weeks. So join now to get that lower price. Here is today's vocabulary list. Context. Context. The background information, situation, or setting that helps you understand the meaning of something. For example, without context, it's difficult to understand the true meaning of her words. Direct. Direct. Expressing something in a clear and straightforward manner. As in, he gave a direct answer to the question without hesitation. Indirect. Indirect. Not saying something openly or explicitly, implying a meaning rather than stating it clearly. As in, instead of refusing directly, she gave an indirect response by changing the topic. Explicit. Explicit. Stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion. As in, the teacher gave explicit instructions on how to complete the assignment. Implicit. Implicit. Suggested or understood without being directly stated. For example, his apology contained an implicit acknowledgement that he had made a mistake. Communication style. Communication style. The way in which people express their thoughts and interact through language. As in, her communication style is very formal, which sometimes makes casual conversations difficult. Have you ever had a conversation where someone seemed to understand your meaning without you saying much? Or maybe you've experienced the opposite, where a person explains every little detail clearly and directly, even when you already knew the context. It is really common to face differences in communication style when you learn a new language. The way people talk in English is very different to how people talk in Japanese or in German. And this is not just about vocabulary or grammar or pronunciation, but about how they communicate, the way they talk. German speakers, for example, tend to be quite direct and clear when speaking. What they say is what they mean. Japanese speakers, on the other hand, use a lot more context to communicate. The same is true even within a language. While English in general tends to be quite a direct language, American English speakers are far more direct than British speakers. British people tend to not be overly negative or positive in a direct way, whereas an American English speaker would probably have fewer problems being openly, clearly positive or negative. Obviously, this is talking in generalizations. Individual people have their own communication styles. The way I communicate is different to the way my British friends communicate. We all have our own style. But cultures in general can be said to tend towards certain communication styles overall. One of the most useful ways to understand these communication styles across cultures is through the concept of high context and low context cultures. Context is going to be a word you will hear a lot in this episode. Context is the background information, the situation or the setting that helps you understand the meaning of something. One of the biggest mistakes that language learners often make is forgetting about context when studying. You could learn all the grammar and vocabulary in the world and train extensively with pronunciation tools, but without understanding culture and context, you will struggle to communicate. I live in Japan, and I am still learning different contextual and cultural rules. My mother-in-law, so my wife's mother, sometimes complains that I speak too formally with her. I learn formal versions of Japanese verbs in all of my textbooks, but this is not how you're supposed to communicate in casual conversation. It also took me a while to realize that people don't often directly or strongly state their opinions or their meanings in Japan. The best example is that it is rare for someone to say no when they are refusing something. If my friend asks me if I want to go to the gym, I will say yes or no. If I ask my Japanese friends and they want to refuse, they will say something like, let's see how my work goes, or I might be busy, or maybe, but it might be difficult. Culture influences communication. As I mentioned earlier, there are some attempts to divide cultures into high context and low context cultures. These terms, originally introduced by the anthropologist Edward Hall, describe how much background knowledge and understanding are required in communication. Of course, there are problems in such a categorization. There are variations in communication styles within a culture. The way someone in a northern English city like Leeds communicates is very different to a southern English town in Surrey. Also, individuals have their own styles, and there are many cultures that don't fit into this low, high context categorization. However, I think this is an interesting concept. So let's take a look at what high context and low context culture means. High context cultures are cultures which use a high amount of context in communication. Their communication styles rely on background information, the situation, and non-verbal information. Non-verbal means things that are not said. So this could be gestures, facial expressions, silence. This means that not everything is said explicitly. Much of the meaning comes from context rather than direct words. Imagine you're in Japan, China, maybe the Middle East. In these cultures, people often communicate indirectly. I gave the example of no earlier. Instead of saying no, they might say it's a little difficult, or just remain silent and not answer. The expectation is that the listener will read between the lines and understand the true meaning. You are supposed to understand from the context what they mean, rather than from the words directly. People rely on tone, body language, and sometimes silence to communicate. Some examples of high context cultures include parts of East Asia. We could describe Japan, China, and South Korea as high context cultures. Middle Eastern cultures like Saudi Arabia, and even some Latin American cultures might be high context, like Brazil. On the other hand, in low context cultures, communication is much more explicit and direct. They use a low amount of context in communication. Words carry most of the meaning, and people don't rely as much on background knowledge or unspoken understanding. Basically, what is said, the words, have all of the meaning inside it. Think about countries like the United States, Germany, or maybe even Australia. In these cultures, people say exactly what they mean. If someone disagrees, they will express it openly. Instructions, business meetings, and casual conversations tend to be clear and to the point. A key idea in low context cultures is efficiency. Conversations should be straightforward so that everyone understands, no matter their background. While politeness obviously still exists, you can still be polite, people generally don't expect the listener to guess their true intentions. For example, if you asked an American or a German colleague, "Do you want to go to the cinema tonight?" and they don't want to go, they might simply reply, "No, I'm busy," or "No, maybe another time." But if you asked someone from Japan, they might not say no, they might say, it's a little difficult. There is no hidden meaning in these low context cultures. Some examples of low context cultures include North America. The USA is a famous direct country. Western Europe, especially Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, perhaps the UK compared to some other places, and then Australia and New Zealand as well. But it is important to note that most cultures exist somewhere in between high context and low context communication. Britain, for example. British English is often more indirect than American English, but more direct than something like Chinese or Japanese. Similarly, parts of Latin America may lean towards high context communication, while others are more direct. And this is despite the fact that most of Latin America uses the same language, Spanish. So even within Spanish-speaking cultures in Latin America, there are very direct and very indirect cultures. These differences between high context and low context cultures can affect how you learn and use English. English, especially in low context cultures like the US, expects you to be clear and direct. So you should learn how to be clear and direct in English. You need to use pronouns, for example. We say things like, "I think," and "you should." In some languages, like Japanese, you can avoid saying I, you, we, and so on. But in English, we need to use pronouns. We need to make it clear who is speaking and who you are speaking about. We're not the best at guessing from context. You should also practice being more direct in your opinions and your requests. A good example is that if you're in a class, like an English class or even a meeting maybe, and someone asks you, "Do you understand?" you should answer yes or no. You have to be clear. Say no if you don't understand. In English, we also tend to speak more actively than passively. I record thinking in English instead of thinking in English is recorded by me. Right? Active instead of passive. I work with a Japanese Thinking in English Patreon subscriber on her IELTS writing practice each month. If you're interested, become a Patreon subscriber, specifically the English Master level for one-to-one sessions with me. But so I work with this Patreon subscriber, and I quickly noticed that she was far more passive in her writing style than the average native English speaker. And this is because in their language, passive sentences are normal. It's very common, much more common than English, to write passively. Whereas in the UK, we're taught to not write passively. In fact, at university, you're only supposed to write passively if you don't know who you're talking about, if you don't know the person or the thing that did the verb. Now, if you come from a high context culture, you might also struggle with direct speech. Some English speakers may sound too blunt or even rude to you. It's common for someone to say their direct opinion, to say no, to express their emotion directly to your face, which can be rude in some cultures. Or you might struggle with requests and refusals. You might think you are clearly asking for something, but a native English speaker might not understand you. You need to request things or refuse things in a way that English speakers do it, not in a way that people in your culture do it. And so you have to learn, you have to practice how to request. On the other hand, if you come from a low context culture, like Germany or Scandinavia, you might sometimes struggle with the way British people communicate. For example, if you're working with British colleagues and they say, "Would you mind looking at this when you have time?" They're probably politely asking you to do something right now or quickly. But they won't say it directly. If you take their words literally, you might think you can do it whenever you want, when you have time, so whenever. But this is not exactly what they meant. They kind of wanted you to do it sooner than later. Importantly, context directly affects how you use English in everyday situations. And I think there are two sides to this. First, if you come from a high context culture, you need to adjust when speaking English, especially in business, academic or international settings, and especially when you're talking with people from native English speaking countries or people from Northern Europe. You should probably be more direct, especially in low context places like the USA. People value clarity. Right? Instead of hinting at something, say it clearly. You should state your opinions clearly. Instead of expecting the listener to guess what you mean, express your thoughts openly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If you don't understand something, English speakers expect you to ask directly. In some cultures, this might seem impolite, but in English, it shows engagement. We want you to ask questions, to get involved in the conversation. As I mentioned before, though, there is another side to this. It's not just about being more direct. English is a global lingua franca. You will interact with people from many different cultures, and each culture has its own communication style. British speakers often use polite and indirect language. Would you be able to send that email when you have time? Might actually mean send the email right now. American speakers tend to be more straightforward. Can you send the email? Is a direct request, not a question. Non-native English speakers from high context cultures might use more implied meanings. So, for example, if you are from Germany, but you use English primarily with a group of Chinese colleagues, you should probably adjust your communication style as well. Don't just expect one side to adjust, but meet in the middle. So here is today's final thought. Understanding high context and low context cultures can help you navigate real life communication more effectively. If you come from a high context culture, you may need to be more direct when speaking English. If you're from a low context culture, adapting to indirect communication, especially in international settings, can be really useful. Since English is a global lingua franca, understanding different styles will help you communicate clearly with people from diverse backgrounds. By being aware of cultural differences in communication, you can avoid misunderstandings and become a more confident English speaker. But what do you think? Do you come from a high context or a low context culture? Have you ever experienced differences in communication style? Let me know by leaving a comment. Leave a comment on this episode on Spotify. If you're listening on YouTube, comment on YouTube. And in fact, can you all go and check out my YouTube channel? I am going to start uploading, maybe I already have, but I'm going to start uploading regular YouTube videos. At the moment, my plans are to do videos on academic and business English, as well as potentially on pronunciation as well. They're going to be very clear and direct videos, like low context communication, I guess. And I just want to provide resources that I enjoy using as a Japanese learner. So go and check out my YouTube channel. And also all of the podcasts are on YouTube. And the most recent, past few months worth of videos have full transcripts on the screen, right? Interactive video transcripts so you can follow along. So go and check it out. In fact, if you want to support Thinking in English, the best way to do it is to become a Patreon subscriber. There are so many great benefits. There's ad-free episodes, bonus episodes every Friday, conversation clubs on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and also technically Wednesday and Friday, depending on where you are in the world. So many great things. A film club, conversations with me, discounts for English courses and classes with different companies and providers, study packs, and the prices are incredibly affordable. In fact, they are a little bit too affordable. So I am considering, not 100% decided when I have recorded this, but at some point this year, perhaps in the next few months, I will be increasing the prices of, especially of my middle level of Thinking in English subscription, called the English Learner level. This gets you 6 conversation clubs a week, plus a bunch of other benefits and bonus episodes and ad-free episodes and Discord access, lots of great stuff. But I think I'm going to increase the price of that level. Currently it is £10 a month, and I'm thinking of increasing it, I'm not sure, perhaps to £15 a month, because it takes so much time and effort to organise all of these conversation clubs. We have lots of members joining, and I'm very underpaid, but I want to keep it as affordable as possible. So go and join now. If you join right now, you will keep paying the price that you join at forever. I still have people paying like £3 a month from when I first started Thinking in English Patreon 2 years ago. So if you join now, you can pay £10 a month. If you pay annually, you can pay less than that. Go and join now. Please become a Patreon subscriber. It would really, 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 really help me. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.